Comrades, it's always a pleasure on this occasion, an honour to be back fighting on the Brisbane line. When Ray was talking about his father in the Communist Party, I couldn't help thinking of my father in the ALP. In 1961, the Communist candidate for Brisbane found himself on television because the ABC had decided that every candidate would be given 2 minutes to put their position in every electorate. So there was the somewhat surprised Communist candidate from Brisbane appearing on the ABC to talk for 2 minutes. And I can remember my father watching the television and saying whatever policy the Communists put forward, bank nationalisation for example, my father kept saying, the bloody Labor Party should say that. And the conclusion I draw from that is that while the Communist Party may have got very few votes, while it was very small compared to the numbers of people in the ALP, the influence that those communist ideas had went way beyond the membership or the vote. And indeed, had there been a mass communist party in Australia, people like my father would have been just as happy to belong to that and to support it as they were to support the ALP. Now, when we think about the last 90 years with this, it's not very difficult looking around this room to tell you that the ambitions, the hopes of the people in 1920 have not been fulfilled. I don't have to go into any detail of the things that have gone wrong in the communist movement in Australia in the last 90 years. The fact that we are here the way we are tonight, we are not representatives of a governing workers' council government for all of Australia after 90 years. So we don't have to go over into great detail at this moment all the things that might have been and all the things that should have been. We do, however, always, of course, have to engage in self-criticism as an important part of being communist and struggling for socialism. So, if we want to know why things didn't turn out the way people hoped in 1920, we don't have to blame anybody else. Another group and other people who left the party. We just need to look and ask questions in self-criticism about our own organisations and our own behaviour. And somebody who's done that with a life of struggle, I want to come up and just read something to you, because for me it gives the right kind of tone to how we should look upon our own lives in struggle. I'm going to ask our comrade Jim Sharp to say a few words and read a poem that I think expresses the right tone for considering these things. Jim.
2 months ago tonight I launched a book of poetry here. I had no idea at that stage, the furthest thing from my mind would be expecting Humphrey McQueen to ask me to read one of the poems that was in that poetry book. But before I do, a little bit of background to that. There's always stages in our lives where we reminisce, whether somebody's died near to us or special events cause you to reminisce, and that this poem was created by a reminiscing, but it's also, in a sense, linked to some of the things we've heard here tonight. New Year's Eve, 1999, when the world was going to come to an end, when computers were going to crash and God knows what else was going to happen, I was at a New Year's Eve party, and most of the people there wasn't a big crowd there, but most of them had been highly involved for about 25 years prior to that, struggling for early education reform. And the main person who led that was a woman called Lil Gwither. And it was on her son's back deck that these people was there, all the friends who'd been in the struggle with her. But there also happened to be another fellow there who I hadn't met and only heard of him briefly, because Lil's son Ross has been a close friend of mine and comrade for 35 years. And Ross is a musician, as you'll see later on afterwards when Jumping Fences plays. And this fellow who was there, his name was Doug something. But he'd been Ross's guitar teacher when he was only still a young high school student. But in his later years, this music teacher was a jazz musician like Ross. So they kept a friendship over the years. But he'd also, in later years, started making guitars, jazz guitars, of the highest quality that were fetching enormous amount of money for the jazz guitarists who could afford them. And I was intrigued by this. What made you so late in life to start making musical instruments? He said, well, I knew John Manifold down at Wynnum, and John Manifold started this instrument making class for working class people, and John Manifold was a communist, for most of you here would know, and he was a communist intellectual, literary intellectual. And he said, I was impressed by the fact that Manifold wanted to not only take music for everyday people to make and sing, but making musical instruments. I was impressed by that. Well, you saw tonight how the communists were involved in the literary scene in Australia. And also, if we would have liked to add here tonight Connie Healy, who wrote the history of the New Theatre in Brisbane. So that set me thinking. I'd had these thoughts going round in my head that comes out here, and 15 minutes past midnight into the 21st century I couldn't sleep, and I started in my head composing this poem. And it's called A Dialogue with a Long Gone Comrade. And that comrade was a guy by the name of Mike Harewood, who unfortunately died young, just at the time as a playwright and a poet. He was about to hit the West End. Unfortunately, he died. So Mike and I were school pals and teenage muckers and class comrades. So this is the dialogue which I think some of us here would have had, wondering why instead of keeping on growing we didn't. So it's a dialogue with a long gone comrade. "'Struth, comrade, how I love you. Don't get me wrong, brother, I wasn't in love, because our relationship most certainly wasn't homoerotic. 'Struth, comrade, one does miss you, because as I'm growing old and mindful of our footprints in the Rotherham Valley, the mud, the slush and the snow. 'Struth, comrade, you and I made mistakes, because the long way didn't enter our headworks. Sure, the system made for hard struggle, and we won bourgeois rights steadily, and domination seemed to be crumbling away. 'Struth, comrade, as this old century ends, one grieves for our class, because its political perceptions of being of and for the class gives the appearance of deep-rooted slumber. Struth, comrades, on the eve of this new millennium, reflect on our words and deeds, and don't let the dark clouds detain you. Travel in search of the principle in contradictions, then daily will the rugged red sun will rise and fall. Thanks for a loan of your earlobes."
As Jim said, we've all had those discussions, either in real time or in our heads, with many people over a long time. And that, I think, is the right spirit in which we should enter into criticism and self-criticism. But moving beyond that, of course, it is that question of moving forward in unity, and as they said in the party in the old days, unity in action. And that comes around specific issues, not around general ideas of unity in action. Clearly at this moment, next week, there'll be unity in action around the Ark Tribe verdict as to whether or not they dare to try to put him in jail and how people respond. As people said during the uprising in Paris in 1968, the reason you put up a barricade is not to stop the police, because they'll just go straight through it. The reason you put up a barricade is to see who is on the other side. And next Wednesday will give us a lot of lessons in who is on the other side. Now, I just mentioned Paris. In 1970, I happened to meet an old communist, a French communist, a professor who some of you would have known here, Jean Chenot, who wrote a book, is an expert on Vietnam. And during the anti-Vietnam struggle, the Communist Party translated and published one of his books about the history of Vietnam, which was widely circulated here. And he came and spent some time here. And I said to him, what are you planning to do for the centenary of the Paris Commune next year? And he, very French, became very angry and agitated with me and said, celebrating anniversaries is like celebrating political anniversaries, is like celebrating the anniversary of a wedding and doing nothing else. It means that love is dead if you only do it once a year. He said, we've already celebrated the centenary. We've already celebrated the Paris Commune. We did that in 1968 by reliving it. That's the way to commemorate events, not simply to have official celebrations for them, but to celebrate them in practice. And we're going to get an opportunity to do that on Wednesday. And there's a continuing struggle here, of course, about the sell-off of state assets. There's plenty of opportunities for unity in action around that. Now, I'm not going to try in any sense put on my historian's hat and give you a short history, a very short course of the history of the various communist parties and organisations, thanks, in Australia. We wouldn't get past the Foundation Conference in 15 minutes. And indeed, if we were here for the whole 4 hours, we probably wouldn't get far into the 1920s. So I want to take a few themes around issues that the Communist Party became very important about. And one of them has been mentioned already, of course, and that's the battle against racism in Australia. Sam's invitation to us and the welcome to country was a real welcome. It wasn't simply a token event, because Sam's engaged in struggle, we're all engaged in struggle, and he was inviting us, as he said, not just to country, but to join in that struggle. Indeed, when one of the Aboriginal organisations reformed in Sydney in 1963, it issued an invitation to the union movement to join it, and it said, the reason we're doing this is because Aborigines are a working class people. And the Communist Party had earned its right to this right from the beginning in the 1920s, when they developed a policy of self-determination and autonomous areas for Aborigines in Australia, to give them the right, now we'd call it land rights, but with more power than that. They were following on the model that was going on in the Soviet Union in providing that kind of autonomous zones for the different minorities there. And that was communist policy. This continued all the way through, and indeed the first Aborigine to be sent as a delegate to an international labour conference was a building worker in Sydney who was elected from the job, and they raised